If you know anything about me, you know how in love I am with analog photography. It's my main squeeze, my soulmate. I mean, my wife's pretty cool, but analog photography is what I live and die for. But if there's one thing I hate about analog photography, it's the dust. Cleaning dust on your scans is tedious, time-consuming, and thankless, because even if you do a fantastically perfect job of cleaning the dust, it's like, congratulations, you didn't screw it up. So it's just something we're all going to have to deal with, especially if you have a hybrid analog-digital workflow like I do, where I shoot and film and then I end up scanning it for digital sharing and printing. Now, necessity is the mother of invention, and so over the years I've had to get better at cleaning dust and develop some more efficient techniques for keeping the dust down. Techniques that I'm going to bestow onto you today. Of course, I'm not the end-all be-all for techniques on cleaning dust, but I just want to share with you how I do it. Now I'm going to break this video down into two main sections. First, we're going to look at how to mitigate dust in the scanning process itself, both before and during the scan. And then separately, we'll look at how to clean the dust on the resulting negatives in Photoshop. If you don't do your own scanning, of course, you don't need to watch that first section. So go ahead and skip past to the second part. I will put a table of contents in the description of this video so you can jump around. But let's talk first with the obvious, which is cleaning dust on the negative before you scan it. You're going to need something to blow the air off. Now, you can use compressed air. I opt for a handheld air rocket. I will link this in the video description. But I tend to prefer this because these make me a little uneasy. You never know when it's going to shoot something out. If someone had it upside down just before you grabbed it. Just make me a little nervous. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but I prefer having something with a little more control, and I know it's just shooting air that's in the room onto my negatives. If you find that one of these air rockets or compressed air doesn't work too well, you could try an anti-static brush. Now, in the scan itself, if you are scanning with a digital camera, on a stand, there's not much you can do in the scanning process to reduce the dust. You just have to clean it later in Photoshop. But if you're using a scanner designed for scanning film, like an Epson V750, V800, V850, or something like that, or maybe one of the older film scanners like a Nikon or a Minolta, they'll probably have hardware and software built in to help automatically remove dust and scratches. The Epson certainly does. And I'm going to be using SilverFast AI Studio along with SilverFast HDR. It's two pieces of software. SilverFast Studio drives the scanner, and then SilverFast HDR is where I actually do the processing of the file. But even if you're using a lower end version of SilverFast or you're using a completely different scanner software entirely, there's probably tools built into it to help remove dust. In SilverFast, there's two of them. There's one called iSRD and one called SRDx. They are both for removing dust, but they do it in very different ways. Let's start with iSRD. iSRD is a phenomenal tool. It works really damn well at removing dust on your negatives. The way it works, I in iSRD stands for infrared. And the way it works is scanners like the Epson can scan the film in both visible light to create the image and then infrared light. And it actually does two passes. So it does the first pass to scan the image so you can see it, and then it does a second pass to scan it with just the infrared channel. And what infrared light can do in a scanner is it can map dust on your film. And it identifies it like a highlighter, completely separate from the image itself. And then by doing those two passes, it can take the infrared scan, which is basically just a map of the dust, and deduct it from the actual image by just cloning over where all the dust was. And like I said, it works phenomenally well. So I apply it on every negative that it can work on, because they don't work on all negatives. But iSRD is super efficient and saves you a ton of time in having to clean it manually. So I'm going to show you iSRD on a negative here. This is Kodak Portra, and there's dust in this image. As we go to the upper right corner, we will see little specks of dust up in the sky. And I could clone those out manually, but I'm going to let iSRD take care of it automatically for me. So I scanned it with the infrared channel. It has that data. I click the iSRD function. We have modes here for automatic, mark, correct, or original. Mark will just indicate where all the dust is that iSRD found. Correct will remove it. And then original is the original negative without the dust removed. So I'm going to put it on mark here as we look at how it identifies the dust. We have a detection slider. If you bring that down, it's not going to mark as many things as dust. It's only going to focus on the real big obvious dust. So you want to bring that up until you're seeing all the dust that you can see with your eyes is actually being marked by iSRD. So I bring that, somewhere in the middle or maybe a bit higher. But we have more functions here kind of hidden away in this little icon that looks like a graduation cap. So that's advanced functions. Because you went to college, you got a graduation cap. You can handle advanced functions. So I click that and we have some new sliders here. First off, defect size. So as you adjust that, that's going to tell SilverFast how big the defect needs to be in order for it to identify it. So again, you want to look at the dust that you can see with your eyes and adjust that slider so that the ones that should be marked are being marked and the ones that aren't. And it's going to be different on every picture, I'm sure, but extension just below that, this is purely to help you see where it's marking. It doesn't have any effect on how it actually removes the dust. It's just to help you see where the dust is being marked. So if you pull that up, the highlighted areas just amplify so you can see it a lot better. So that's extension. I don't need to bring that real high because I can see the dust that it's marking. So I'm going to switch over to correct right now so we can see if it's removing the dust effectively. Pretty damn good job, I gotta say. So let me go back to the original so you can see. There's the dust, and then correct, melted away. One cool feature that I have in SilverFast HDR here is I have an option for use manual offset. Basically what this does, this allows me to shift the clones to be more in line with the dust it's removing. What can happen sometimes is that the infrared channel is just off ever so slightly. It's a little bit down and to the right. And so it's not actually fully removing the dust, it's leaving little crescent moons. If that's the case, you can use manual offset to shift the dust removal up or down with your horizontal and vertical axis. Usually it's going to do a great job. You don't need to use manual offset, but I've had it sometimes where it seems like all of the corrections are just a little bit down and to the left, a little bit down and to the right. On this image, it's doing a great job of overlaying the clones on the proper area, so I'm not going to use manual offset, but that's the option there. And then finally, you have an option for eraser. So if iSRD happens to be removing dust in some area where it shouldn't be, it identified something as dust that isn't dust, you can use the eraser tool to just remove that from its identification. So I'll do one just as a sample here. This helps with mark. So if I go over to this one and just erase it, it removes the dust removal. So the mark actually comes through again. But I don't want to do that here because iSRD is identifying all the correct areas. Sometimes it'll mark areas around edges. So you see like around this cell phone tower, it's marking all that. If I go to correct though, you see it's not actually really doing anything. So it's identifying that as dust, but it's not doing anything to it. So I'm not worried about it. If I wanted to make sure it wasn't doing anything, I would just use the eraser to make sure it didn't touch that. But I've definitely noticed that, especially on high contrast edges. It will just kind of identify it as, oh, that's dust, but then it decides, nah, I'm not gonna do anything about it though. So don't worry too much about what it marks. Look at the correction option and see if it's actually creating any weird distortions or anything like that. So iSRD, really, really cool, but it only works on color print film and reversal film. It does not work on black and white film. Black and white film still has silver in it, and the infrared channel doesn't pass through silver properly to be able to identify the dust. So you cannot use iSRD on black and white film. You also can't use it on Kodachrome, I believe. So if you have old Kodachrome slides, you can't use iSRD on that because there is silver in Kodachrome film. But all other reversal film, all other print film, it should work just fine. So then what do we do for black and white film? What do we do for Kodachromes? That's where we have SRDx. So let me switch over to a different image here. Go to black and white. So if I zoom in 100%, you will see dust again in the upper right corners. Lots of white flecks around here. So SRDx is going to try to identify those pieces of dust and clone them out. Now it's software based, it's not hardware. It doesn't have like an infrared channel to pull from. It's just trying to identify things that look like dust. So it does a good job, but like how does it tell the difference between a freckle on a portrait and a piece of dust, or a stray hair and a scratch? You know, it's going to make mistakes, and the settings you put in are going to help it or hurt it, but this is how it's going to work. So I'm going to turn on SRDx. Again, we have those same modes, mark, correct, and original. I'm going to put it on mark at first here so we can see the defects. Now we have options for finding dark defects or bright defects. If it's reversal film, your dust will be dark. And that's because the dust was on the film, it blocked the light in the scan, and that left it looking dark. But on print film, all the dust is going to be bright white. And that's because, again, it was dust that blocked the light, which left dark marks, but then we inverted the image. Because it's a negative, we inverted it, so all that dark dust became very, very bright dust. So because this is a negative, I'm going to look for bright defects only. There's really no reason to look for dark defects because it wouldn't be a dark defect when the image got inverted. So bright defects, the detection slider will adjust, you know, how it's finding defects. So if we bring it way up, I'm going to bring it up to like 13, 14. You see it's starting to identify every last little piece of dust. But when you bring it too high, what happens is it starts to identify the texture of the image as dust. So it's going to remove all of this, which we definitely don't want. So you want to bring the detection back down to not include the areas that are actually just image texture, because you don't want to have the software trying to clone those away. It's going to get all muddy and weird looking. So you kind of have to jockey back and forth between the sky and the textured areas and just make sure it's highlighting the areas in the sky but not the areas that have texture. Tile size, like before, this is going to dictate how big the defect needs to be in order for it to identify it as dust. If you bring it up really high, it's going to have to be a really big defect before it says that's dust, let's remove it. So you want to keep it low enough that it's identifying those little specks up in the clouds there. So I'm going to bring that down. I think 4 is probably going to be fine. Let me go to a textured area, make sure I'm not screwing anything up there. It's definitely removing some stuff on the texture, but I'm going to show you a tool that's going to make it so we can isolate the ground so that it's not receiving the SRDx tool. And I'm actually going to bring detection up a little higher to make this even more obvious. If we go to this graduation cap again, it pulls up this new tool, defect marking. What this allows us to do is we can actually go find something that it didn't identify as a defect and then mark it. So we actually brush right over it and it will add it to the list of defects to remove. So that's number one. Number two is the eraser. This is really handy for going to areas where it's trying to remove dust and you know it's not actually dust, it's just texture in the photo. You can put it on eraser and just adjust the radius, of course, but you can just erase any of the areas you don't want it to apply SRDx. So all the textured areas down here I can just erase, and I'm telling SilverFast, do not apply SRDx in these areas. But that could take a long time if I'm going in and brushing every area that doesn't need SRDx. What would be cooler is if I could tell it, just do the sky. And so that's what we're going to do with the next tool. I'm going to zoom back out so I can see the whole image. And if I go down to mask, you'll see this polygon mask option. I want it to apply the SRDx to just the sky. So what I'm going to do is outline where the sky is pretty roughly, and then it's only going to apply it there. So I go to the top, I click and hold, by the way. Don't click once, click and hold. And I just kind of draw a pretty sloppy line along the landscape so that I'm only going to get the sky. You'll see that big straight line connecting my current point to the end point. That's going to complete the circle once I'm done here. Okay, and then I can let go because that last point is going to connect to the first point. Ask you to name the mask, just call it mask for sky or whatever. And then it's only gonna apply SRDx on that area. So watch, if I zoom back in and we're on mark, so we can see where it's gonna apply the SRDx, you'll see that the sky has all of its marks, so it's gonna remove dust up there, but if I go down to the foreground, it's no longer marking the foreground. And that's because the mask is only on the sky. So that's a real quick, easy way to tell it, only focus on the sky, leave everything else alone. And in fact, if I do this, I can bring the detection up a lot higher because I know it's not going to affect any of the textured foreground. And then that way it's going to target every last little piece of dust in the sky. So I bring the detection up to like 16 is maybe a bit much. Let's try 14. Okay, so I bring the detection up to 14. It's identifying every last little thing that could be dust as dust. It's going to mark it for removal. Now I go to correct. And boom, look how clean the sky is now. So I check other areas. There we go. It's looking real good. Now I want to jump back to that picture of the post office again, because this is going to be a real obvious example of what happens when your SRDx settings are all wrong. So if I zoom in here, I'm actually going to turn off iSRD first. I'm going to zoom in with SRDx instead. So obviously I can use iSRD here, but watch what happens if I try it with SRDx. So I'm going to bring the detection really high, too high, just a little too high actually. I'm not going to go nuts. And so it's identifying everything in the sky that's dust, which is awesome. But if I go to the building, you'll see it's starting to identify most of the building as dust because it's a textured building. It's got aggregate in the walls and it's identifying that. And in fact, it can start to identify the lines in the street, in the parking lot, as things to remove. And so if I apply that, it's actually going to give me really weird lines in the parking lot. It's starting to remove all that. The walls look all smooth. It took all the aggregate out of the walls. So the point here being is if you're going to use SRDx, just be careful with your settings. You got to finesse them a bit. Make sure you're removing the dust without removing too much. So that's iSRD and SRDx. iSRD is phenomenal. SRDx is pretty damn good as long as you get the settings set up just right. But even with this stuff, even with these tools, or if the film is coming from the lab already scanned, you're going to have to clean the dust on the resulting file. So let's look at some techniques for that. So if we open up this black and white image in Photoshop, there's tons of dust in the sky. Now, if it wasn't a black and white image, iSRD would have worked wonders on this. SRDx would actually work pretty damn well too, but let's look at how to do it more manually in Photoshop. So now, of course, the obvious way to do this is to use like a clone tool or a healing brush or a stamp tool and just go around and manually click each one. That's a nightmare. Don't do that. It is a royal pain in the ass and a waste of time. There's a much, much faster way to do this. I can basically sweep the entire sky with a couple of quick brush strokes and they'll pretty much all go away. What I'm going to utilize here is a filter under noise called dust and scratches. Now, dust and scratches is going to try to automatically identify dust and scratches in the image, and it does it by looking for edges. So it looks for, you know, bright spots in a field of dark, and then it's going to identify that as an edge to be removed. If we bring the threshold down, you're telling it identify even the tiniest little defect that you can see. If you bring the threshold up really high, you're telling it only identify the most obvious defect that you can see. So we want to find a happy medium here where it's clearly eliminating all the dust that we can see, but we don't want to go so low that it starts removing the grain. That's your sweet spot. You want to be able to see the grain of the film, but also be removing the dust. So just zoomed in 100%. I'm going to bring the threshold down until I feel like the grain isn't really being negatively affected, but the dust is melting away. Yeah, I think around 15 is going to be good. Now the radius. Radius is telling it how much to encroach on that piece of dust when it clones it. So if you bring the radius down too low, it's not going to completely cover the dust. You got to bring the radius up until it's fully covering each piece of dust. So I have to bring that up until the dust disappears, but not too much further. If I have big pieces of dust, I'm gonna have to bring that radius up quite a bit higher than if it's all just tiny little specks. So again, just finesse it until you're removing the dust without going much further. So I'm gonna do radius around 8 or so. Check the whole sky, make sure everything's disappearing. I'm gonna turn preview off. Yeah, so over here you can see preview off, lots of dust, preview on, they all go away. Now I'm gonna click OK to apply it, but you'll notice the mountains now look like a crappy painting. So I don't want that. I want to apply dust and scratches only on the sky. So the way I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna go to my history panel. I'm gonna go back one step in the history. For me, it's open. That removes the dust and scratches I just applied. But now I'm gonna click the box next to dust and scratches. That turns that step into what the history brush is going to brush in. And with the history brush, which over on the left here, allows me to brush in certain areas and it will pull from that step of the history. So in other words, it's gonna brush in dust and scratches. So I'm actually gonna zoom out for this, because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a nice big brush and I'm just going to go across the sky. One nice big sweeping brush here. I'm gonna make sure not to cover any of the mountain peaks. I don't wanna go on any sort of details because it's going to make it look painted. So there we go. As I get closer, I can shrink my brush down, my history brush, and just go in and remove any little stragglers around the upper portions. There, there. All right, and there we go. Now there will, of course, be dust in the textured areas. We'll address those in a minute, but look at how quickly we went from a filthy, dirty sky to a clean sky without negatively affecting any of the textured areas. Really cool feature. This even works pretty well on what I call film rash. I don't know if anyone else calls it this, but sometimes on a negative, you'll just get this kind of rash looking effect. It's not really pieces of dust on your film. It just looks like the grain got messed up right there. It could be from the developing process or as it rolled through the rollers on the camera, but this can work for that as well. So again, I'm gonna go up to filter, noise, dust and scratches. I'm gonna adjust my settings until I'm gonna have to bring the threshold down on this because that's pretty faint dust. So the more faint the defect is, the more the threshold needs to come down. Bring the threshold down until it goes away. And bring the radius up. And again, I'm trying to not negatively affect the grain of the film too much, but now I'm gonna click OK, but you can see it actually removed the power lines and the building looks all painted and terrible. So again, I'm gonna go into my history, go back one step, click the box next to dust and scratches, go to my history brush, and I'm just gonna brush in dust and scratches on that film rash. Oops, overlapped the building, so I gotta undo that. Now, of course, you can do like a more precise mask if you want. You can do the marching ants around things. You can mask off areas so you can get real close to the edge of the building without overlapping it. I just tend to do these nice big sweeping movements because I feel like it hides the rash or the dust enough to not be distracting, but it's not so time consuming that, you know, I start banging my head against the wall. So I could go around here and just carefully remove all that film rash. Now this may not work perfectly well on textured areas, you know, like the walls maybe, but you can try it. Covered the power line there, so undo that. So things like the shingles here, it's gonna be a little tougher to do. I'm probably gonna have to do that manually, but I can go around and history brush anywhere I need to remove that rash. Yeah, it doesn't work too well down there, so we're gonna have to do something a little more manual in these highly textured areas. But dust and scratches can get you like, you know, 80% of the way there, 90% of the way there. You're saving a ton of time and a ton of frustration. Now there's always going to be straggler pieces. If we go back to the monochrome one, you know, there's a little bit of dust in the textured areas, and I don't want to use dust and scratches on that because it's going to ruin the texture. So we just need to manually spot remove those. I'm going to use the spot healing brush, and I really love this brush because it just automatically picks where to clone from, and it does a great job like 99% of the time. If it doesn't do a good job, if it's trying to clone it from somewhere that doesn't make sense, you can switch over to stamp. Some images I feel like I have to do stamp on the whole thing because the spot heal for some reason is just overthinking everything and it's trying to blend things that shouldn't be blended. But most of the time spot removal works great, or spot healing rather, works great. All right, so those are the tools to use. But a couple other things I want to point out when you're doing this. First off, you know, how deep do you need to go on removing dust? Like, do you really need to remove every last tiny little speck? You want to be smart about this. Really think about how big is this thing going to be presented, and that's going to indicate how carefully you need to clean all the dust. You know, if you're going to print it real huge, yes, clean every last little piece of dust. But if it's just going on Instagram, just clean the most obvious dust. Clean the big stuff. Or if it's just going on your website, just clean anything that you can see when it's blown up about that big on your website. Now, in terms of magnification, like, should you clean the dust at 100% zoom? I'll tell you what I do, but don't necessarily do what I do. I, generally speaking, clean the dust zoomed in only to 50%. I almost never clean dust zoomed in 100%, especially on ultra high res files. The main reason for that is I use monitors that are not what Apple calls retina displays. I don't know what other manufacturers call it, but it's where they have like the 300 pixels per inch in the display. Mine are much lower resolution. They're only like 100 pixels per inch or something. I got these intentionally because I actually don't want a high-res display. Because what I like about these lower resolution displays is if I zoom in 100%, I'm actually blowing up the image bigger than print. So I can see much closer into the image without it getting pixelated. I'm seeing the individual pixels naturally. But that means the image will actually look bigger on my screen than it's going to look in print. So like if I'm going to get an 8x10 made and I've already sized it properly for 8x10 and I zoom in 100%, it's actually going to look bigger than 8x10 on my screen. So I zoom in only to 50% because that keeps it about the size that it's actually going to be printed at on my screens. So 50% gives me the closest thing to a 100% representation of the print. So that's why I do 50%. But if you're using a retina display, if you're using a 4K display or some super high res display, you're probably going to have to do all your cleaning at 100% because the image is actually going to look smaller on your screen than it does on my screen. So I go to 50% to accommodate for the fact that I'm a lower resolution screen. And finally, I always sharpen the image before I clean the dust. And that's partly because sharpening the image is like the first thing I do after I scan it. I scan the file in SilverFast AI Studio. I make the adjustments in SilverFast HDR. I save it as a TIFF and it goes right into Photoshop. And that's where I do a smart sharpen. I clean the dust. And then it goes into Lightroom for my color and tonal adjustments. I prefer the user interface in Lightroom and the ability to copy and paste adjustments easily, so I do all my color and tonal adjustments there. But I always sharpen it first, then do my dust removal in Photoshop. Part of the reason you want to do sharpening before dust removal is sharpening will highlight the dust more, so it'll make it more obvious and easier to identify, both for you and for the dust and scratches filter. All right, that's it on cleaning dust. I hope you found this useful, and if you did and you want to help support this channel, go to nickcarverphoto.com/contribute. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.